Welcome to From World War to Cold War, Part 1.
An interactive U.S. history tutorial for students like you.
The Cold War has its origins in World War II, so let's start by reviewing that conflict. The Second World War lasted from 1939 to 1945. The two sides were known as the Axis powers and the Allied powers. The major Axis nations were Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy. The Big Three allies, those that coordinated the winning side's military strategy, were the United States of America, Great Britain, also called the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, or USSR. China, France, and many other nations also fought for the Allies. The Big Three leaders for most of the war were U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. FDR and Churchill were friends and close collaborators, but Joseph Stalin was definitely the odd man out in the alliance. Churchill and Roosevelt were the elected leaders of democracies, and both had viewed Stalin with suspicion and hostility before the war. Stalin was the absolute dictator of a communist state, the Soviet Union. In fact, when World War II began in Europe, Joseph Stalin had initially formed an alliance of sorts with Adolf Hitler, a non-aggression pact in which the Soviets and Nazis agreed not to attack each other and to divide up territories like Poland between them. But Hitler double-crossed Stalin in spectacular fashion in 1941, invading the Soviet Union with more than 3 million troops. The sneak attack forced Stalin into an alliance with Roosevelt and Churchill for his nation's survival. The Big Three alliance, therefore, was a marriage of convenience designed to beat the Axis, and little more. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin first met in person at Tehran, Iran, in November 1943. There, they planned the upcoming Allied invasion of France that would become known as D-Day. In February 1945, the Big Three met one final time in Yalta, a city on the Black Sea. By this point, the Soviet Red Army was only 40 miles away from the German capital of Berlin. The war in Europe was almost over, and the Allies made plans for the post-war world. Germany would be divided into 4 zones controlled by the Big Three plus France. So would Berlin, although the entire city lay well inside what would be the Soviet zone. Stalin insisted on keeping some of Poland's territory that the USSR had conquered, but he promised the Polish free elections. Stalin also promised that the Soviet Union would join the war against Japan after Germany fell. Finally, the Big Three agreed to support a new international peacekeeping organization, which would become known as the United Nations. The UN's charter would be signed later that year. Few knew it at Yalta, but Franklin Roosevelt was a dying man. Just 3 months into his newly elected term, on April 12, 1945, the president passed away. His vice president, Harry S. Truman, took the oath of office and would lead America through the final months of World War II. The new Big Three first met in late July 1945 in Potsdam, Germany. Hitler was dead, and Germany was occupied by the Allies, but the war with Japan was still ongoing. President Truman was not the only new member of the group. Winston Churchill was voted out of office during the conference and was replaced midway by Britain's new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. The Allied leaders continued to discuss the future of post-war Europe. At that point, the Soviets occupied most of Eastern Europe: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and Eastern Germany itself. Stalin's Red Army had conquered these territories from the Nazis as it moved west from the USSR. For Harry Truman, the right thing to do was simple. After years of Nazi rule, these nations deserved democratic elections and self-determination, the right to govern themselves as independent nations. Joseph Stalin had a different set of priorities. Germany had attacked the Soviet Union twice in the last 30 years by sending troops through Eastern Europe. Stalin wanted to maintain Soviet control over this region so that his nation could keep a buffer zone against future aggression from Western Europe. Another factor motivated Stalin. The Soviet Union had been isolated before World War II, but it was officially dedicated to spreading communism to other nations. If it could establish friendly communist governments in the nations of Eastern Europe, and maybe beyond, it would greatly boost the USSR's standing in the world. Truman saw Stalin very differently than Franklin Roosevelt had. FDR, always optimistic and diplomatic, had been friendly to Stalin, describing him often as a man he trusted and could work with. Truman, more realistic and more bluntly, was suspicious from the start and had a harder line toward the Soviet Union from the time he took office. Early in World War II, Truman had expressed a public desire that the Nazis and Soviets might simply kill each other off. Even before meeting Stalin, he was convinced the Soviet leader had lied at Yalta about allowing free elections in Poland. Their face-to-face meeting in Potsdam was at times awkward. Truman, later on, said that his first impression of the 5'5" Stalin was that he was a little bit of a squirt. The two failed to come to an agreement about Eastern Europe. At Potsdam, Truman hinted to Stalin that the U.S. had developed and was ready to use a new weapon of unusual destructive force. He was referring, of course, to the atomic bomb, which had been successfully tested just that month in the United States. Truman recalled that Stalin seemed unsurprised. All he said was that he was glad to hear it and hoped we would make good use of it against the Japanese. Although Truman could not know at this time, Stalin knew exactly what the president was talking about. The Soviets had more than one spy inside the Manhattan Project, the top-secret effort to develop the first nuclear weapons. August 6th, 4 days after the Potsdam Conference ended, Truman gave the order to drop the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, on Hiroshima. 2 days later, the Soviet Union officially declared war on Japan. The next day, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. 5 days later, the Japanese surrendered unconditionally to the Allies, ending World War II. It would be known as VJ Day. The U.S. exited World War II in the strongest position of any nation. In many ways, it was the world's sole remaining superpower. The American economy was booming, and the war itself had taken place far from U.S. shores. Slightly more than 400,000 Americans had died, a number far less than the losses suffered by the other two major powers. In comparison, an astounding 20 million Soviet citizens had died battling the Axis. But the vast USSR still possessed a great industrial and military capacity, and in Joseph Stalin, it was led by a cunning and ambitious leader determined to make his Soviet Union the superpower of the East. After Potsdam, President Truman continued to insist on elections and self-determination for Eastern Europe, and for the Soviets to withdraw militarily. But as he feared, the Soviets did not withdraw, and did not allow free elections. By 1946, most of the nations of Eastern Europe had become communist satellite states, countries that were technically independent, but whose governments orbited the heavy influence of the Soviet Union. This part of Europe became known as the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Bloc, or the Communist Bloc. In February 1946, Stalin gave a provocative speech in which he declared to the world that communism and capitalism were incompatible. He blamed capitalism for causing World War II and predicted another war between communism and the West sometime in the 1950s. As a result, he announced a new Soviet 5-year plan to triple weapons production. The American people and their government found the speech very disturbing. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas called it a declaration of World War III. Less than a month later, in March, ex-Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave a speech of his own in, of all places, tiny Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. Churchill had been invited to speak there and was accompanied by President Truman himself. Churchill began by praising the Soviet people and his wartime comrade Joseph Stalin. But he went on. A shadow has fallen upon the scenes so lightly lighted by the Allied victory. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subjects in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. The communist parties there have been raised to preeminence and power far beyond their numbers, and are seeking everywhere to obtain totalitarian control. Police governments are prevailing, and there is no true democracy. With the simple but powerful phrase Iron Curtain, Churchill cut to the core of the Cold War, the idea of a divided Europe for the West. On one side of the curtain, people were trapped under harsh communist rule and enjoyed few liberties. On the other side, people were free to choose their own governments, to be successful, and to live their lives as they saw fit. Even when the historical reality did not always fit neatly with his metaphor in the years to come, Churchill's Iron Curtain speech would continue to capture the essence of the Cold War. When he heard about it, Stalin called the speech a call to war. George Kennan was an American diplomat and Russian expert serving in the Soviet capital of Moscow when World War II ended. He observed the early years of the Cold War from inside the Soviet Union, and not unlike Joseph Stalin, Kennan became convinced that the USSR and the West were on a collision course. In February 1946, as his appointment to Moscow drew to a close, Kennan cabled the U.S. State Department a telegram. Known as the Long Telegram because of its length, more than 5,000 words, Kennan offered his analysis of Stalin and explained how the U.S. might best deal with the Soviet Union while avoiding war with it. Kennan called Stalin insecure and paranoid, someone who used communism mostly as a justification for his dictatorship. Kennan thought diplomacy with Stalin was pointless and predicted that he would continue to act aggressively. He suggested that in order to resist Soviet expansion, the West would need to strengthen itself in order to contain communism where it already was until Stalin's eventual death. Then, maybe a different leader could be reasoned with. Kennan's analysis impressed many in Washington, including President Truman. He was recalled to the United States and became a key figure in shaping the administration's Cold War policy. In an article published in Foreign Affairs magazine, writing under the name X, Kennan further explained his idea of containment. The Soviet threat was real, he wrote, and cannot be charmed or talked out of existence. Instead of traditional diplomacy, Kennan said that the main element of any United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be a long-term, patient but vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. Soviet pressure against the free institutions of the Western world is something that can be contained by the application of counterforce at a series of constantly shifting geographical and political points. In other words, the way to defeat the Soviets was not to attack them, but to resist and block them at every turn by strengthening the West's institutions, defenses, and even its values. Kennan predicted that the struggle would be long, demanding, and expensive, but he did see it as a path to victory. In the end, it would produce either the breakup or the mellowing of Soviet power. Although he did not invent the term, George Kennan had described the future course of what would soon be called the Cold War. It was to be a state of warlike hostility that kept the Soviet Union in check in order to avoid actual war between the Soviets and the West. President Truman favored Kennan's policy of containment. Not everyone in his administration or his military agreed. Some thought the policy was too risky and would lead to eventual war. Others thought the exact opposite, that the policy was cowardly, a refusal to stand up to the Soviets militarily. Truman believed containment to be the best, or rather the least worst way of dealing with the new threat to world peace. He did not want to start World War III, especially now that nuclear weapons were part of America's arsenal. In 1947, crises in Greece and Turkey provided President Truman with several opportunities to put the policy of containment into action. The Soviet Union was demanding territory that belonged to Turkey, and Greece's government was resisting a communist takeover from within. Truman asked Congress for $400 million to aid the two nations, along with a show of U.S. military force in the region. Some congressmen, especially from the Republican opposition, objected. Dean Acheson of the State Department warned them that if Greece and Turkey fell to communism, 3/4 of the planet would soon be communist. Congressional leaders went along, but one Republican warned that for the American people to be on board, the president would have to scare the hell out of the country. Truman was up to the task. In an address to the nation justifying American aid, he said that if any nation, even a small one like Greece, adopted communism or had it forced upon them, then confusion and disorder might well spread to other nations. Failure to prevent this may endanger the peace of the world and shall surely endanger the welfare of the nation. In later years, this belief would be called the domino theory, that communism was like a disease that must be quarantined and stopped from contaminating any more nations than were already infected. In this metaphor, the U.S. and its allies were like doctors, treating patients and stabilizing each one in order to prevent the spread of the disease. The president's response would come to be known as the Truman Doctrine. The idea that the U.S. must support free peoples who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. In other words, if nations were threatened by communism from within or without, the U.S. would intervene to rescue them as a matter of America's national security. This bold idea would become the foundation of U.S. foreign policy for the next 40 years. With U.S. aid, both Turkey and Greece were able to resist communism. In the Mediterranean, the West had won its first Cold War victories, although it should be noted there was nothing cold about the Greek Civil War. More than 200,000 died over several years before the communist rebels were defeated. Aid to Greece and Turkey was only a preview of the much greater assistance the U.S. would provide to Western Europe beginning in 1948. Most of Europe was nowhere close to recovering from the devastation of a world war that had been fought in its backyard. Factories were wrecked, transportation systems destroyed, and millions of people had been made homeless by the war. Many were starving. Europe needed assistance on a massive scale. In March 1948, Congress approved the European Recovery Program, better known to the world as the Marshall Plan. It was named after Secretary of State and former General George C. Marshall. The U.S. made a commitment to spend close to $13 billion over the next 4 years to rebuild the economies of Western Europe. This was in addition to more than $14 billion that the U.S. had already spent or loaned to help Europe since the end of World War II. All European nations were invited to apply for Marshall Plan aid, including the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. But as suspected, the USSR declined aid and ordered its satellite states in Eastern Europe to reject it as well. 16 nations ultimately wound up receiving Marshall Plan assistance. You can see them in green on the map here. The larger the blue bar, the more money the country received. In order, the nations that received the most aid were Great Britain, France, West Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands. There were several reasons why the U.S. invested so much money in Europe. First, it was humanitarian aid. Some simply saw it as the right thing to do. Second, by reviving Western Europe, the U.S. made it far less likely that communism would take root there. Nations that turned or fell to communism tended to be unstable places. If Europeans continued to live in chaos and poverty, the chance was greater that the Soviet Union might offer solutions to their problems. An economically strong Europe was more likely to remain democratic. Third, the U.S. needed Europe as a healthy trading partner. One of Americans' greatest post-war fears was slipping back into a Great Depression. To prevent this, and to keep its own economy strong, the U.S. needed capitalist markets overseas in which to sell American goods. In fact, most Marshall Plan dollars would return to the United States once Europeans were able to spend them on U.S.-made products. This helped fuel the general domestic prosperity of America in the 1950s. As a result of the Marshall Plan, Western Europe once again became an economically prosperous part of the world. In fact, the years from 1948 to 1951 marked the most rapid period of economic growth in Europe's history. The Soviet Union reacted angrily to the Marshall Plan. Stalin believed, not incorrectly, that the money was intended to draw European nations more closely into America's orbit. When Czechoslovakia, a communist state that remained the only democracy in Eastern Europe, expressed interest in Marshall Plan aid, the USSR provoked a communist coup or uprising that brought the nation firmly under Soviet control. Next, the Soviets threatened Berlin. The German capital was like an island that lay entirely in Soviet-controlled Eastern Germany. And strangely, Berlin itself was still divided into 4 sectors, controlled by the Soviets, French, British, and America. As you can see, the western parts of Berlin could only be accessed through territory held by the Soviets, and in 1948 they moved to blockade or cut off all access from the West. The USSR did this in retaliation for the Western Allies' plan to officially unite their 3 sectors as the new nation of West Germany. After World War II, all 4 allies had considered converting Germany into an agricultural nation without heavy industry or the capacity to wage war again. But Britain, France, and the US changed their minds and were now determined to unite West Germany and rebuild its economy using the Marshall Plan. This was the last thing Stalin wanted, a strong German state bordering his Eastern Bloc. So he sealed off Berlin, trapping about 2 million West Berliners behind the Iron Curtain. This left them without access to food, fuel, and other essentials. Would the US and its allies be forced to abandon all of Berlin to the communists? Harry Truman was firm that the West not give up on even this tiny piece of democratic Europe. "We stay in Berlin, period," said the president, but he also needed to avoid war. So for almost a year, American and British planes flew in and out of West Berlin about 277,000 times, delivering over 2 million tons of goods to the people there. By only using airspace, they were not invading East German territory. Stalin did not dare shoot down the cargo planes, or he would have started a war, and by 1949, when he realized that the Allies would continue the Berlin airlift indefinitely, he called off the blockade. The city then became officially divided into West Berlin, a disconnected part of the new nation of West Germany, and East Berlin. Many viewed the Berlin airlift as a triumph of containment policy. Stalin had acted aggressively, the West had firmly blocked his move without resorting to war, and in the end, the USSR backed down. In 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany, better known as West Germany, was officially created. The Soviets responded by officially creating the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. Although Stalin protested mightily and said it was illegal, Berlin would remain divided for the entire Cold War. But because the US and the West were pledged to defend it, West Berlin would remain one of the hotspots of the Cold War, a trigger that could start World War III at any time.